Brought to you by Lean Body, the #1 protein shake in gyms across America.
What's going on, everyone? My name is Ben. I teach people about the anatomy of lifting. Today we're gonna go over all the different abdominals, the major 3, and then we're gonna go over an exercise for each portion of the abs. Those 3 motions alone are basically gonna cover all that you need to in terms of training the abs. Today we're gonna go over all the different abdominals, the anatomy first, the major 3, and we'll talk about the 4th a little bit later. And then we're gonna go over an exercise for each portion of the abs. So the first ab that we wanna consider is the external oblique. And as its name indicates, it sits outside of the body. So what that means is it basically runs kind of in this direction. There are a bunch of different portions of it, but that's a pretty good way to sort of illustrate it, right? It kind of runs diagonally down that way. And so what that means is that when it contracts, right, think about sort of point A and point B, it's just gonna pull like any other muscle. And so what that means is that if Liv keeps her hip here, it's gonna kind of rotate the trunk this way, and then it's also gonna bend the trunk forward, right? So kind of like a rotation and side bending type of thing. Now, if I scoot around to this side, and we think about the muscle that sits underneath of the external oblique, the internal oblique. And what that does is if we picture the external oblique sort of running this way, the internal oblique does this cool thing where it runs diagonally in the opposite direction, right? So if you can kind of picture these two, it actually sits underneath of the external oblique and makes a big X. And so what this guy does is, unlike this guy, is if you keep your hip here and you sort of turn your trunk to your left here, it's gonna rotate Liv this way, and then it's also gonna side bend her in that same direction. Right, so both of the obliques are really cool because they sort of sit around the trunk like this towel that's wrapped around the body, and they twist and turn you in various directions in addition to the side bending component. So we'll go over specific exercises for those two in a little bit, but the last one, which many of you know, is this rectus abdominis. And it runs from the top of the bottom rather of the rib cage and the sternum, all the way down to the top of the pelvis. That function is pretty simple. It just does our sort of normal crunching sort of activity. And then in addition, and this is maybe something that a lot of people are maybe not as familiar with, is if you just turn in either direction like you did before, just like your trunk, not your hips. Yeah, what will happen with these fibers is if this hip stays over here, yeah, there you go, just twist, there you go. Perfect. These will actually, unlike the marker is indicating, these will sort of wrap and turn in this direction as well. So again, the cool part about the abs is that whenever you're doing a sort of twisting activity, right, whether in your daily life or in sports, they're all gonna contribute to maintaining that rotation and maintaining the ability of you to manage the relationship really between the rib cage and the pelvis. Now, the last guy, the 4th guy that I mentioned, is the TVA. Many people are familiar with the TVA. It kind of just sits like a corset around the waist, right? So if you imagine someone just sort of squeezing you like this, just squeezes you inward. So it's highly involved in any kind of activity where you're gonna need to generate like a lot of pressure, like a back squat or a deadlift or something similar. But in terms of its muscle action, we can't really target it specifically in a weird sort of a way. So now we're gonna go over an exercise for the external obliques first, the internal obliques, and then we're also gonna talk about the rectus abdominis in that order. All right, so we're gonna go over 3 different exercises, one for the rectus abs, one for the external, and one for the internal oblique. Now, if you do have the fortunate ability to access one of these, you can just use them, thread your elbow through and do what we're gonna do with them right now. But a lot of people don't have these, and that's okay, because we can just use a D handle to do all of them. First off, we're gonna do a 6-pack rectus abdominis exercise. So Liv's gonna get underneath of the pad. She's gonna make sure that when she puts this down, that it's really snug to the top of the quad and the thigh. You don't want it to be in a position where if I lift this up, there's a lot of wiggle room right there. So you wanna make sure it's smushed. And then you also wanna make sure that at every point in this motion, you're basically just gonna do a calf raise through the floor, right? So make sure that's nice and snug. So single D handle is really all you need. And for this one, what Liv's gonna do is she's gonna grab them, palms facing her. And what she's gonna think about is, as she comes to the top of this motion, she's gonna keep her shoulders and her elbows basically at this 90 degree angle. And as she goes through the motion toward the top, she's gonna think about pulling her ribs as high as she can to the ceiling and arching her back. And what that's gonna do is that's really gonna bring a lot of length to these tissues. And then as she goes down to do the crunch, what she's gonna think about is crunching all the way down to her pelvis, perfect. And as you can see, all the motion is occurring through the spine. It's not like she's hinging forward and backward like some kind of RDL or something. Everything is sort of coming up, arching through the spine, ribs come up, and then ribs sort of crash down and inward together as the elbows drive down toward the pelvis. Now, a really helpful cue for this one that I think is sort of counterintuitive is rather than to think about the abs and the six pack alone, think about sort of spreading the back out, right? So Liv is almost gonna imagine expanding the backside of her rib cage, stretching out the lats, stretching out the erectors as she goes through the crunch. And then again, as she returns to the top, it's all just gonna be about arching, unarching, arching, unarching. If we move toward an exercise for the external obliques, you can keep the exact same setup. All you're gonna do instead is you're gonna use one handle this time. And something that I do find helpful is just to loop the elbow through with this. It's easy to hold the handle with two hands. Sometimes it could be a little bit cumbersome to do it with one. So Liv is just gonna loop that D handle right through so it's sort of on the back side of the upper arm. Now let's imagine that we're just gonna target the right side of the obliques, the right external obliques, which if you recall, remember, those ones are gonna rotate you to the opposite direction and they're also gonna side bend you, right? So what we're gonna do is we're just gonna mimic that posture here. Liv is gonna essentially just turn away from her working side, which in this case is her right external oblique. And then she's just basically gonna do the same exact form of a crunch that she just did, now sort of down to that right leg, as opposed to sort of straight down in the middle. And the cool thing about all these different motions is that in terms of their execution, they're very similar, right? So it's all about sort of opening the front of the ribs and then closing the front of the ribs. Opening the front of the ribs and then sort of using maybe your elbow, really drive down, sort of excellent, right in that sort of middle ground between, you know, both hips. If we move over to the internal oblique, what Liv is gonna do is she's going to put both of her legs to one side. And keep in mind, we're still sort of trying to aim for the right side of the ab wall. Obviously, you would want to do both sides if that was a goal of yours. And instead of sort of rotating toward her center, right, so toward her pelvis, what she's gonna do, she can turn away from her hips this way. And then the same exact cues, same exact process is gonna occur, where now since she's turned toward that side, she's gonna crunch down to that same side hip. You can think about this as kind of like a traditional side bend with a little bit of a twist, no pun intended, you got it, yeah? Okay, so those are the three sort of really simple motions that you can do on any lat pull down. Again, all you need is a D handle. You can play around with, you know, how you like to grip this thing, whether you like it more in your elbow or more in your hand. But those three motions alone are basically gonna cover all that you need to in terms of training the abs.